What does the first commandment of God speak of? It strongly says that Him alone shall you serve. The theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity inform and give life to the moral or cardinal or human virtues. The cardinal or moral virtue of justice is the stable inclination of the will to give to each one his due. Justice calls for giving what is due to man and what is due to God. The justice due to man is called natural or legal justice. The justice due to God is called the virtue of religion. Charity leads us to render to God what we as creatures owe to Him in all justice. By virtue of religion, which is the justice due to God, we are bound to obey God to reach Christian perfection. John Paul II, in his 1979 encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, said that by virtue of religion, our spirit is set in one direction, the only direction for our intellect, will, and heart, which says towards Christ our Redeemer, because there is salvation in no one else but Him. St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica said that the virtue of religion has one unifying principle: God as the creator and governor of the world. It is under this one aspect of God that man worships and serves God. Furthermore, St. Thomas said that the virtue of religion bends man's will towards God's service, and by nature, man is directed to God as to his end. So, to achieve eternal salvation, man must know his end in order to direct all his thoughts and actions towards God. St. Thomas Aquinas added that by virtue of religion, man offers his worship to God, not because God needs it, for he is complete in himself, and no creature can add anything to him, but because man needs to give due respect to God's glory. The virtue of religion is also the worship that we give to God alone. In Latin, worship is latria, which basically means adoration, a reverence directed only to the Trinity. This worship or latria is done by subjecting our mind and will to God to find our perfection and salvation. The virtue of religion has two acts. First, the internal act, and second, the external act. The internal act, which is the worship of the mind, consists of 1, devotion, and 2, prayer. Now let's define devotion. Devotion is our personal, face-to-face encounter with God. It is our total consecration to God in submission to Him. In devotion, there exists a willingness to undertake service and worship to God. What about prayer? Prayer is the lifting up of the mind and heart to God. When prayer is continuous, it is called union with God. St. Paul reminds us that whatever we do, be it eating, working, recreating, or walking, it must be offered for God's greater glory in union with God. This requires living in the state of grace without committing any mortal sin. Let's discuss the second act of the virtue of religion, which is the external act. The external act of the virtue of religion refers to the external or outward gestures of worship. St. Thomas Aquinas mentions 4 external acts of worship. 1. Adoration. 2. Sacrifice. 3. Oblation. And 4. Vows. Let's take the first external act of worship, adoration. To adore God is to acknowledge Him as God, as Creator, as Savior, the Lord and Master of everything that exists. As it is written in Luke chapter 4, verse 8, "You shall worship the Lord your God, and Him only shall you serve." Both Luke chapter 1, verse 46 to 49, and Article 2096 of the Catechism invariably agree that to adore God is to acknowledge, with respect and absolute submission, of the nothingness of the creature, who would not exist if not for God. These 2 readings also concede that to adore God is to praise and exalt God and to humble oneself, as Mary in the Magnificat did, confessing with gratitude the great things God has done and declaring how holy is His name. Furthermore, Article 2097 of the Catechism says that to adore the one and only true God prevents tendencies of self-will and self-love from surfacing, which makes us devils in human form, slaves to sin, and idol worshippers in this world. The second external act of worship, sacrifice. This is the external offering of a sensorial thing, performed by the priest to show God's supreme dominion and man's complete subjection to Him. Article 2100 of the Catechism explains further that since man acquires knowledge from his senses, he needs sensorial signs to show his submission to God. An example of this is the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The outward offering of sacrifice must be deeply motivated by internal sacrifice. These internal motivations are the following. 1. A broken, humble spirit is the sacrifice acceptable to God as mentioned in Psalm 51, verse 17. 2. Love of neighbor and mercy towards enemies is what Jesus desires. Not merely sacrifice as we find in Matthew chapter 9, verse 13 and chapter 12, verse 7. This means that we may assist at so many masses, but if we cannot forgive our brothers and sisters at home, our sacrifices are rejected by God. 3. Only the sacrifice of Christ on the cross is the perfect sacrifice because He forgave all His enemies. This is what we read in Luke chapter 23, verse 34. And I quote, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." When we offer our suffering as a sacrifice in union with the passion and death of Jesus Christ on the cross, it becomes meritorious and acceptable to God for the conversion of sinners. An example of this is Saints Francesco and Jacinta, who offered their daily sacrifices for the love of God and in union with Jesus' death for the conversion of sinners. And because of these children's generous offering, Portugal was spared from the chastisement of the Second World War. The third external act of worship, oblation. This is what we call the first fruit offered to God. They are donations of something, of one's effort, given for divine worship. Jesus offered himself as an oblation to the Father to ransom men from sins. It is essential for oblations that they be made voluntarily, and it is only under certain circumstances that person makes this oblation. For instance, Saint Catherine of Siena offered her life as an oblation to God in union with Christ's passion and death, in reparation and victimhood for the sake of unity of the Church, which was then so divided, having two popes and warring factions among cardinals who were aligning themselves with political leaders. Saint Catherine of Siena received the stigmata of Jesus, 5 wounds, including the crown of thorns. For 6 months, Saint Catherine suffered the passion of Christ and later died. Her death paved the way for the unity of the Church, who finally acknowledged only one Pope. A century later, reform was initiated in the Church through the help of Council of Trent. The fourth external act of worship, promises and vows. The evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience made by religious men and women who promised to totally dedicate their lives in the service of God. For example, the Carmelites, Dominicans, Salesians, Franciscans, just to name a few. These are the typical example of people dedicated exclusively for the external worship to God. A vow or promise is defined as a pledge made to God, which contract a person to do or to avoid doing in particular things. Article 21:02 of the Catechism defines a vow as a deliberate and free promise made to God concerning a possible and better good, which must be fulfilled by reason of the virtue of religion. The women religious submit their will to God through their superiors, renouncing something good, such as matrimony, to become the spouse of Christ. They likewise renounce material possessions, as God becomes their only portion and lot. This is the perfect way of becoming a disciple, as described by Christ in Luke chapter 9, verse 23, which says, and I quote, "Unless you deny yourself, take up your cross, you cannot be my disciples." What then is the right to religious liberty? Freedom of religion is a basic right that must be given by every society to its citizens. Pope Paul VI promulgated the document, Dignitatis Humanae, which explains social and civic freedom in matters of religion. Chapter 1, paragraph 2 of this document states that all men are bound to seek the truth, especially in what concerns God and His Church, and to embrace it and hold on to it as they come to know it. This means that the state cannot force a Catholic to comply to the legalization of abortion, nor to pay for employees for their reproductive rights mandated by the government. Catholics cannot be forced to vaccinate with medicine that is coming from the cells of the aborted fetus or embryo and then allowed to die after the experimentation. The virtue of religion binds Catholics not just individually but also socially. Christians are therefore bound to evangelize constantly men, to infuse the Christian spirit into the mentality and mores, meaning the characteristic customs and conventions, as well as laws and structures of the communities in which they live. Again, this instruction was decreed by Pope Paul VI in the document Apostolicam Actuositatem. Added to this, the document Dignitatis Humani clearly states that Catholics have the duty to make known the worship of the one true religion, which exists only in the Catholic and Apostolic Church. In this, Christ shows his kingship over all creation, and in particular over human societies. No state law can, therefore, force Catholics to act against his conscience in religious matters, whether in private or in public, alone or in association with others. For instance, the state law cannot force church clerics to officiate homosexual marriage or marriage between the divorced and remarried people because it is against their Christian belief. Article 2106 of the Catechism states, "Nobody may be forced to act against his convictions, nor is anyone to be restrained from acting in accordance with his conscience in religious matters, in private or in public, alone or in association with others, within due limits." For instance, there are countries that legalize one religion. For example, like in the countries in the Middle East. Catholics are not bound to obey this because Article 2107 of the Catechism explains, and I quote, "If because of the circumstances of a particular people, a special civil recognition is given to one religious community in the constitutional organization of a state, the right of all citizens and religious communities to religious freedom must be recognized and respected as well." Again, in countries where childbirth is regulated by the state, or let's say, in near future, microchipping would be enforced as a form of control, Article 2108 of the Catechism has this to say, "Catholics are not bound to follow this because of the right to religious liberty. The right to religious liberty is neither a moral license to adhere to error, nor a supposed right to error, but rather a natural right of the human person to civil liberty. Therefore, immunity which just limits from external constraint in religious matters by political authorities." After worshiping and serving God alone, the first commandment gives its first prohibition when it instructs, "Have no other gods before me."